Have you ever wondered how to conquer the 6 most common fears of retirement? Well, if so, stay tuned to this week's episode of the Retirement Income Source, where it's all about the income. And welcome to this week's episode of the Retirement Income Source, where it's all about the income. I'm David Scranton, here with my good friend and co-host, Sarah Samuels. And this week, we've got an incredible show for you today, whether you're, a little bit under age 50, whether you're in your 60s, or whether in your 70s or 80s. And that is how to overcome, first of all, how to identify, and also how to overcome the 6 most common fears of retirement. So, Sarah, I know this past weekend you were sitting home all weekend, and you and Justin were thinking about and strategizing about how to overcome the 6 most common fears of retirement, were you not?
Well, not quite, Dave, but it's great to be here, of course, with you and with our listeners and our YouTube viewers out there. We weren't talking about our fears concerning retirement necessarily, but we actually were talking about one of these fears in relation to my family, and that's longevity. Dave, you know, I've talked about my grandmother before on the show, right? She's in her early 90s, and she lived out in North Carolina. Unfortunately, she's having some issues where she needs someone to be in the home full-time to help her and her husband. They're falling and having issues like that. But it's an issue, right? Because of the longevity. It's this double-edged sword where it's awesome. I'm so happy we still have my grandmother around, of course. But it is difficult because she doesn't want someone, some stranger, as she says, in her home to take care of her. She's resistant to assisted living. So it is a big fear that I think a lot of people out there have.
But when you and Justin talk about, at your ages, when you talk about life expectancies, though, you know, what's the average life expectancy that you're always taught exists for someone like yourself?
About 75, I think, right? Late 70s
Late
is
70s,
about average, right?
Maybe 80.
Yeah, maybe 80.
So, but yet you hear so many people living into their 90s these days, and the question is, why is that? Well, it's because, you know, math is a funny thing, right? And
tell me, Dave, how's math funny?
If you make it to age 60, well, now you're expected to live to a later age. If you make it to 70, you're expected to live to even a later age, and age 80 even to a later age, right? Think about it. What's the average life expectancy of all the people that reach 91? Right? Well, it's obviously not late 70s because they're already 91.
They already passed that about 20 years ago, right?
Maybe it's 94, something like that. And that's because, you know, when you do the averages for somebody at a certain age, you know, all the people who died at a younger age are out of the math. So when you look at averages, you and Justin can't plan for that late 70s number. You've got to say, well, we may die before retirement and not even have to worry about retirement planning, right? God forbid. But if you make it to 65, here's an interesting statistic. If you were a life insurance actuary, right? And you know actuaries are pretty smart people, right? They're pretty mathematical.
Yeah, exactly.
Now, if you were a life insurance actuary and you were talking to a couple age 65, do you know what you would be telling them their average life expectancy would be if they've already made it to 65?
What?
Age 92.
Wow.
Now that doesn't mean each one's going to live to 92. It means that at least one of the couple is going to make it to 92. And you can gamble upon which one, but heck, that means that in retirement, if you're retiring at 65, you've got to plan on average 27 years of retirement. And, you know, that's a long time.
Yeah, nearly 30 years. Well, Dave, just a minute ago, I mentioned, you know, longevity is a double-edged sword. It's great to still be here, right? But you have to plan for that. You have to prepare for that. So another issue concerning longevity is Social Security. And our next Ask Dave question actually comes from Kyle in Florida, so our neck of the woods. But Kyle says, I'm in my mid-50s. Do you think Social Security will still be there for me when I retire?
Well, Kyle, great question. A lot of people are asking that. If you're in your mid-50s, I think you're pretty safe because, you know, you could start taking it in, you know, essentially if you're 55, 7 more years. And you know, if you were in your 20s, I might say, who knows what it's going to look like. It'll probably be there, but who knows what. The worst case scenario, from what I understand, is that maybe a 25% reduction in benefits, and that's because the Social Security Administration says that if no changes are made, that come just about the time you can take it, Kyle, that the benefits will drop by 25%, which means that you'll still get 75% of the benefits, and that's if no changes are made in the system or how the system is funded. But I think that, people who collect Social Security are voters, and as long as politicians want votes, I think they're eventually going to get to fixing the problem. So 75%, I would say, of what's being projected is worst case, but I think you might be in a much better situation than that.
Yeah. Well, Kyle, thank you so much for sending in your question. And if any of our listeners out there have a question that you want Dave to answer, all you have to do is email us at askdave@retirementincomesource. That's SOURCE.com. Thank you so much for spending your listening here with us on the Retirement Income Source, where it's all about the income. I'm Sarah Samuels, and I'm here with the host and my good friend, Dave Scranton. And today we're talking about how to identify the 6 most common retirement fears and ways to really conquer them. So we're just talking about longevity and how that's affecting the Social Security picture, where Social Security could potentially be insolvent unless something is done with Congress. But it can also affect pensions, right?
Yeah, it affects pensions, and that's why we've seen this migration since the 1970s away from traditional pension plans, the type that pay you a monthly income every single year as long as you live, more to 401ks, where now the retirement risk is on you and how much you could save and on investment performance and everything else. And that's because people are living longer, there's more liability that the companies have, and they're worried about that. Stockholders certainly don't like that. Shareholders don't like that. So why is it such a big deal? Well, think about it. If you are going to live 5 years in retirement, which is really essentially what happened when Social Security first started, people collected at 65. The average life expectancy was 67. So you retired for a couple of years. Well, Social Security Administration could take all the money you saved, in theory, divide it by 2, pay you half of it at age 65, half at 66, and by 67 you're dead, right? It's pretty easy.
Right.
Even if you're going to retire for 5 or 10 years, you can say, okay, well, if it's 10 years, I can divide the amount of money by 10, maybe add a little bit for interest. So to think about it like a loan, right? If you take a car loan and your payment, let's say, is $400 a month, a good part of that $400 a month is principal, right?
That's how it is when you first start paying off the loan.
Well, with a car loan, it's going to be principal early on because it's a 5-year car loan, right? So there's some interest in there, but at least 3/4 of the payment is going to be principal, right? But let's say you take a 30-year mortgage. Now you make your first payment, and guess what? It's a different story, isn't it?
Right, because 30 years versus 5 years.
Yeah, so with the 30 years, it's mostly interest at the beginning because it's a long time. It takes a long time so that year 2, you have a little less principal, so you pay a little bit less interest, a little more principal. Year 3, the principal balance is down even a little bit more, so again, you pay just a little bit more principal, a little bit less interest. But the curve really starts to turn in your favor in the last 10 years. So if your average life expectancy at age 65 is 27 years, right?
Yep.
You've got to plan for 30 years or more. So it's much like a 30-year mortgage, but in reverse, right? In the case of a 30-year mortgage, you pay a tiny, tiny little bit of principal first year, but guess what? Somehow, miraculously, that mortgage gets paid off.
In the 30 years, right.
That's right. But think about this as the opposite. You have a pile of money. You take all the interest and dividends, but yet somehow, miraculously, you take a tiny bit of principal, just a tiny bit of principal year 1, and somehow, miraculously, that account is spent down within 30 years. So 5 or 10 years, you can count on spending it down. Over 30 years, you pretty much got to count on your interest and dividends. You can't count on spending your principal because of that, the way a 30-year mortgage works versus a 5-year car loan, if that makes sense.
Yeah, and I think that's the reason why longevity nowadays is making it so difficult for people out there to plan for 30 years or more of retirement. But there are more fears out there that our listeners and our viewers have, Dave. And this one, I think it's not just a fear that retirees have. I think a lot of people have this fear in light of what's going on in the market.
That's right. So speaking of that, let's talk about that coming up in just a moment. So if you're concerned at all about market volatility that's occurring right now, well then stay tuned. I'm David Scranton here with Sarah Samuels, and this is the Retirement Income Source, where it's all about the income.
Hey, you're listening to the Retirement Income Source, where it's all about the income. I'm Sarah Samuels, and I'm here with Dave Scranton. Today, we're talking about how to overcome these 6 most common retirement fears.
Right.
We talked about longevity, which is really a double-edged sword, and how that's affecting Social Security and how that affected pensions in the past. But now this fear is volatility, and I think a lot of people, Dave, are fearful of what's going on in the markets. It's not just retirees or people getting close to retirement that have this concern about market volatility.
Yeah, and it's unfortunate because people shouldn't have to. You know, if you're a regular listener to our show, you know that I always talk about those 10 years leading up to retirement. Those transition years are the most important years in your investing lives. So you have the accumulation years, which is most of your working years, where you're putting money away, you're looking for total return. You don't care if that total return comes from growth or interest or dividends, right? And then you have the income years, which are when you're retired and drawing income. Most people neglect, though, is the 10 years leading up to retirement. Those are the transition years. Those are the years where you have to start focusing less on total return and more on income, interest, and dividends. So, Sarah, we all go back to that, you know, my famous equation, right? So go ahead. What's my famous equation? You know.
Oh, Dave, you're putting me on the spot. All right, let me think. It's total return equals income plus growth.
Yep. TR equals I plus G. Total return equals income plus growth. And income, of course, is interest and dividends that come off investments, and growth is capital appreciation. So again, when you're younger, you don't care whether you get total return from the I or from the G. It really doesn't matter. But as you get in those transition years, it should matter. And see, here's why market volatility shouldn't concern people, Sarah. But it does, because it concerns them if they haven't made that transition. If you have made that transition and you're generating enough interest or dividends to satisfy your retirement goals, then does it really matter what the underlying investment is worth if you don't plan to sell it in retirement, if you just plan to live off the interest and dividends?
I think part of the transition too, Dave, is that 10 years before you retire, you're still working, right? So all of that money that you don't need right now because you still are receiving income from your paycheck, you can put right back in your account and just actively, you can reinvest that and grow that account organically. So now 10 years later, by the time you're ready to retire, you have even more money than you thought.
Well, that's true. In fact, the income component actually accentuates your dollar cost averaging when you're in that 10-year transition period leading up to retirement. Because, you know, as you get older, you're not dollar cost averaging as much. You know, your balance hopefully is much bigger relative to what you're saving every year. Hopefully you've done a good job. And that means that, you know, dollar cost averaging is great in theory, but it's not as helpful as it was in your early years. But if you have dividends and interest getting spun out, those can be reinvested and could help you, which helps you buy more shares on the dips when the market's down. So, you know, it's funny, Sarah, because we talked in the last segment about how with people living longer and longer, that you shouldn't count on spending any principal, right? We talked about a 5-year car loan where year number one, you know, first payment, you're paying mostly principal,
right?
But on a 30-year mortgage, it's almost all interest, right? And that analogy tells us that, hey, if you might live 30 years into retirement, if that's what you want to plan for, and you should, it means that you should really plan on just living off the interest and dividends and not touching a dime of principal. But this volatility that you touched on is a second reason that people should do this. Because now if the markets drop and you're counting on taking principal in retirement, now you've got to sell more shares when the market's down. And now you even further and more rapidly cannibalize principal. So if people listen to what we talked about in the last segment, living off the I and not the G, then volatility really should be a non-issue, except for maybe the emotional stress you feel when you see your accounts going down.
Right. Yeah. Well, our next Ask Dave question actually covers one of the next fears. And so we're going to talk about how to conquer this fear. So we have Monica out of Wisconsin, and she says, I'm really worried about a recession. What can I do now to prepare? I'm 45 years old.
Okay. Okay. Well,
She's a younger listener.
Yeah. So how you answer the question at your age, at 45, Monica, correct?
Monica.
Monica. Okay. Again, math guy, great at numbers, bad on names. I don't know why, just how I'm wired. But so Monica, you know, at 45, the biggest concerns about recession are losing your job, right? You have a recession, your company pulls back, they contract, they lay you off. So at age 45, the best thing you can do in a time of recessionary fears is to, you know, make yourself as valuable as you possibly can at your company and reduce the chances that you get laid off accordingly. So that means, you know, don't participate in any quiet quitting, right? Don't get in a situation where you're pushing somebody for a raise because the unemployment rate's low, because that can turn on a dime. And if you're the one who's construed to be slightly overpaid by the boss, you know, you could get laid off. But in your personal life, strive to pay off your debt, build your emergency fund, so if you do get laid off, you can better weather the recession.
Monica, thank you so much for sending in your question. And if anyone out there has a question that you want Dave to answer, maybe you want him to try to predict the future and tell you if there's going to be a recession or not. But if you want Dave to answer your question, all you have to do is email me at askdave@retirementincomesource, SOURCE.com. Thank you so much for listening to the Retirement Income Source, where it's all about the income. I'm here with Dave Scranton. I'm Sarah Samuels, and today we're covering the 6 most common retirement fears and ways that you can overcome them. So we've talked about longevity. We've talked a little bit about volatility. And our last question from Monica in Wisconsin just covered the topic, the fear of recession, which I think is a common fear, not just, again, with retirees.
Well, so Monica was, you know, 45 years old. So she's not even in the transition years yet. So for her, how to overcome the worry about recession is, you know, as I described it. But what if you're in those transition years, or what if you're in the retirement years, where actually getting income? Now the answer would be a little different, Sarah, because now, you know, recession is really a manifestation of market volatility, right? Markets don't do well during a recession. So the solution becomes similar, you know, make sure you're set up in the right way so that you don't have to worry about recession. You don't have to worry about drops in investment values. So first of all, you don't want to be in any high-flying stocks, right? Because if there's a risk of a recession, some of the high flyers can, or the first companies that can go belly up, right? If you're in bonds, you want to stay away from junk bonds because, you know, if you're in junk bonds, again, in case of recession, those are the ones who are more likely to default on their debt. So that's always a concern. But once you're diversified and you've adhered to those first 2 policies, then the next thing is really making sure that you have enough income, is that you're living off the interest and dividends. You don't need the principal. So if a recession pushes the market down, right, which it did, right, Sarah, you know, we talk about this all the time on the show. From 2000 to 2007, the market was underwater for almost 7 years, and then it was underwater again for almost 6 years from 2007 to 2013. So if you were counting on taking principal during that time to fund retirement, you'd be selling at a big loss.
Right. You'd be losing money and breaking the rule, right? Selling at a loss.
That's right. So when the markets finally recovered 13 years later, you know, you'd have a fraction of your money left. But if you just lived off the interest and dividends, and left the principal there, well, then by 2013, you would have had all your money back. You would have had a full recovery. So again, it's how to overcome volatility in many ways is the same as how to overcome worries about recession.
Yeah. And that first big drop back in 2001, the early drop, the tech bubble bursting, that was part of the reason why you made the switch, right, Dave, as sort of a traditional financial advisor to really focusing on being an income specialist.
Yeah, and the time was fortuitous for us. I mean, I knew that, you know, we were going to have tech bubble was going to burst. PE ratios are way too high back then. It's almost
And how'd you know, Dave? You were just
century.
reading the writing on the wall. You were paying attention to the signs.
Well, yeah, when price earnings ratios and the markets get overvalued, you know it's too good to be true. It's not going to last forever. And they were so high that it was going to take a while before things, you know, got better. And sometimes there's good timing for things. So back then I was worried about the markets, but interest rates were high. So I was able to lock people into decent interest rates on bonds and preferreds and even some CDs. Well, if you think about the timing, it's very much the same now. You know, yes, the market is down on average, the S&P, you know, 15, 17% from its peak, but the interest that you can earn on bonds and bond-like instruments is 50% higher. It's much greater. So if you're trying to generate if you're trying to generate income now compared to a year and a half ago when rates were lower, you actually get more income today, even though you have less money. So that's the thing. People need to realize that even if they make a transition from total return focus to income focus today, yeah, they may have less money because the market dropped, but they're getting so much more in terms of interest and dividends, if they do it right, that they'll still be able to get more income. But the problem is if you push your luck, Sarah, that may not continue because, you know, if the Federal Reserve kills the economy trying to kill inflation, then guess what's going to happen? Then the markets drop, interest rates go back down, and now you're earning less interest on less money. So I think now might be the perfect time for people to consider making that transition if they haven't yet done so.
Yep. And Dave, I think you just mentioned why using the word inflation. Just like high blood pressure is the silent killer,
Yeah.
inflation can really be a silent retirement killer. So we're going to give you some tips to help overcome dealing with inflation and where you should look to be invested. You're listening to the Retirement Income Source, where it's all about the income. I'm Sarah Samuels here with Dave Scranton. We'll be back. Welcome back to the Retirement Income Source, where it's all about the income. I'm Sarah Samuels, and I'm here with Dave Scranton as we are talking about the 6 most common retirement fears and ways that you can overcome them. So far we've covered longevity and how it's this double-edged sword. It's great to still be here, but you got to pay for it while you're still alive, of course. Volatility and how that's going on in the markets, plus recession, how that's a big concern among people, not just retirees. But now, Dave, let's talk about inflation. Why is that the retirement killer?
Number 4, the silent killer. Just like high blood pressure, right? High blood pressure is a silent killer in the medical field. So the silent killer in the financial field is inflation, and that's because it's insidious. You know, as costs of things go up, it creeps up on you. But so you may not feel a 3 or 5% increase in the average cost of goods, but all of a sudden, if it's 4 this year and 4 next year and 4 the year after and 4 after that, now all of a sudden you're approaching 20%. You're at a point where it's like, whoa, wait a minute. You know, my money goes a fifth less far, and that's why it's a silent killer. And you know, the trouble with it is it's really hard to keep up with inflation in your investments, Sarah. And part of the reason is because inflation is always caused by different things, right? So the definition of inflation is too much money chasing too few goods. So you can either have inflation because you have too much money out there in the economy, or you can have inflation because you don't have enough goods that are being produced, right, or enough services. And ultimately, you know, the textbooks talk about inflation being maybe one country at a time, right? So the idea is that if one country is struggling with certain things, the value of their currency drops. The price of things doesn't really go up.
Right.
The value of the currency drops, and therefore they need to spend more units of that currency, in our case more dollars, to buy that particular thing, whereas other countries might not have to spend any more of their currency. But that's if it's one country at a time. See, the problem this time is that we've had cheap money floating around the world, all the established economies now since 2008, since the second part of the market crash. And as a result, with all that money, the demand for goods and services has gone up. And this whole response, in addition to the pandemic, has made it even worse.
Right. Well, and it seems like the Federal Reserve, even the experts, Dave, don't really know what's causing inflation. It's almost like they're just throwing darts against the dartboard, right, trying to figure it out.
Well, they kind of do know, and it's their fault because it's the Federal Reserve and Congress that started writing checks and throwing money around. And that's what causes the demand side of it. They also know that the economy was intentionally shut down by the government, which really caused a lack of supply of goods and services for a period of time. So it was really the perfect storm for inflation. But for investors, you know, think about what we're taught, right? Well, if you want to, first of all, we're taught things like, well, stocks are a good hedge against inflation. Okay. Well, I've got news for you. You know, inflation went crazy in 2022, but did the stock market go up?
No, not as much as inflation did.
Yeah, stock market, you know, was down 18%, 17% on the year. Yeah. We were fortunate because, you know, our strategy were geared more toward picking individual securities, so we were up generally speaking last year. But for most people, yeah, they were down in the stock market, right? So stocks in general aren't a good hedge against inflation. So what else do you have? We have commodities, right? But guess what? Most major commodities like gold and silver, the things people would put in as a hedge, didn't do well last year either, right?
Of course, the gold and silver guys out there won't tell you,
They won't tell you that. That's right. Even Bitcoin, right? Bitcoin lost half its value last year, right? So that doesn't work. And, you know, if any of our regular listeners, Sarah, know that I'm not a big Bitcoin fan, right? So the reality of it is it's really hard to keep up with inflation when you're an investor. But, you know, there are some ways that I want to talk about really in just a minute, but but all the traditional things you hear typically don't work.
Right. And it's not just the cost of goods that seem to be going up, it's medical costs too, and really
Yeah.
healthcare costs. In fact, I believe healthcare inflation doubles essentially every 12 years. I think
Yeah,
that was the
historically
statistic,
speaking, yeah.
historically. But our next Ask Dave question actually covers this. So we have Chloe from North Carolina,
Hmm.
and she says, Dave, I'm really concerned about healthcare costs. I'm retiring in a few years. What
Hmm.
can I do?
All right. Well, great question, Chloe. And, so healthcare costs. So the first thing you can do is take care of yourself. Let's start there. Do everything you can to avoid major illnesses. Take care of yourself. Eat right. Exercise. Don't smoke. Don't drink too much. I know I sound like the doctor preaching right now, but the reality is that's the most important thing in avoiding healthcare costs is to avoid healthcare problems, right? But then as you approach retirement, at age 65, you're going to sign up for Medicare. Most likely to sign up for Medicare Part B, which is going to cost you money, and it's going to come out of your Social Security benefits once you start collecting, those. And then the other thing is getting the right Medicare supplement, and there's specific people that specialize in Medicare supplements. And you have to decide what makes sense for you. And you really have to learn about it. You can't just wing it because it's not like when you're working, right? Sarah, when you're working now, we have first dollar coverage, right? You go to the doctor, you hand them your card, you have nothing to worry about, right? Because we cover first dollar.
Yeah, our healthcare plan is actually really, really generous here.
And that's great when you're working,
Yeah.
but
Once you leave, though, you're out of luck, right? Or you
yeah.
can be out of luck if
Yeah,
you're not prepared.
but Medicare has more holes in it than Swiss cheese, right? So the problem is you can't do that with Medicare, which is why you need a supplement. And to make it worse, Medicare only covers 100 days of convalescent care or in-home health care. After that, you're on your own. So long-term care insurance is something, Chloe, you have to look at also and determine whether or not it's right for you.
Well, Chloe, thank you so much for sending me your Ask Dave question. And if anyone has a question that you would like Dave to answer on a future show, all you have to do is email us at askdave@retirementincomesource, source.com. And thank you so much for spending your weekend here listening to the Retirement Income Source, where it's all about the income. I'm Sarah Samuels, and I'm here with my good friend Dave Scranton as we talk about the 6 most common retirement fears and give you some tips to really overcome them. So we've talked about longevity, we've talked volatility, the risks of a recession and how to prepare for that, plus inflation as the silent killer, and medical costs and what people can do now to prepare for that future. So, Dave, if you're a younger person, do you is there any long-term, besides long-term care insurance, what about life insurance? Is that something that you should look into if you're a younger person, or is there any benefit if you're an older person getting it?
Well, yeah, there are certain types of permanent life policies, not term policies, Sarah, which also have long-term care benefits. So some of the money can be accessed early if you have medical issues, need full-time home health care, or need convalescent care. So that's part of the equation if you're younger. But I think the biggest thing a younger person could do is save as much money as they can, because in some ways, the best way to cover long-term care concerns, convalescent concerns, home health care concerns, is to have more income than you need, right? My good friend, Greg in Tulsa, says the perfect retirement is having more income than you need, every single year for the rest of your life in retirement.
Yep. No one ever complains about having too much money in the bank, right?
Yeah. So if it costs you, now you have to start early, but let's say it costs you $100,000 a year for home health care, right? Which in a lot of states that's a number. Other states it's higher. So imagine now you retire and you have $100,000 of income in excess of what you need, right? So when you're healthy and you're in those go-go years of retirement, you could spend that extra $100,000. You could travel, you could do everything you want. And then all of a sudden, when you start to get older, where you're out of those go-go years, you don't want to do that anymore, then you've got the ability to have extra, now you have extra income that can be used to cover those medical costs, to really self-insure. So I think the best thing you can do is save as much as you possibly can in early years and get ahead of it. Pay attention to your investments, stay educated, stay informed, because now you'll have a better retirement in the go-go years. And if you do take care of yourself and those go-go years last in your mid-80s, heck, that's a lot of fun. That's 20 years of retirement or more. That's enjoyable.
Yeah.
And then after that, if you slide backward, well, now you've got extra income for medical costs. And God willing, you fall asleep peacefully in your sleep one night. You pass away in your sleep one night peacefully. Well, then, your heirs get a little bit more.
Yeah. And that's what I think is one of the best things, right, about investing for income is that all those years, those 30 years or even more for retirement, you're living off the income that your
Hmm.
investments are generating. So at the end of the whole thing, right, end of the
Yep.
game of life, you have that money still that you can then do whatever you want with, right? You can give
You,
it to your
you
heirs.
can.
You can use it for medical costs if that's what you need. And that's why I think
Mm.
it's really an
And
interesting
and
strategy.
like I said, Sarah, too, the only real way, and I didn't really close the loop on this, the only real way
Yeah.
to protect yourself for inflation is to not spend all the income. So again, if you have more money, it's generating more income than you need or want. If you can reinvest some of that, now you're growing your money organically. You're growing it the old-fashioned way through the reinvestment of interest and dividends. So again, another reason why being smart about investments in early age and saving as much as you can is important. But as you know, it's not just about what you make, it's also about what you keep.
Right, exactly. And the only time that too much money could be a problem, of course, is when it comes to tax time if you haven't
Right.
prepared for your taxes. So, we're going to help you overcome that fear and give you some tips as to what you can do. You're listening to the Retirement Income Source, where it's all about the income. I'm Sarah Samuels here with Dave Scranton.
And welcome back to the Retirement Income Source, where it truly is all about the income. I'm David Scranton here with Sarah Samuels, and we've packed a pretty good show today, haven't we, Sarah?
We have. We've
Yeah.
covered a lot of topics, Dave. Really, the six biggest fears, right, that the retirees are
Six biggest
facing.
fears, right? So, number one, longevity, right? Living too long and how you can only really live off the interest and dividends and not count on your principal anymore, not count on spending your principal, right? Number two, market volatility, something that's timely today, what we see going on. Number three, fears of recession, again, timely today. Number four, inflation, one more time, timely for the time, right? And then lastly, we talked about healthcare costs and what to do to protect yourself there. But, there's only two things that are certain in life,
And
and
what
they
are they,
are
Dave? Oh, let me think. I got it. Death and taxes, right,
death and
Dave?
taxes. That's right.
Yeah.
And, you can't control death except for, well, maybe trying to stay healthy. Maybe you can stack the odds a little bit in your favor. But you can have a little bit of control over taxes. And I think the biggest problem that I see is that when pensions went the way of the cuckoo bird, traditional pensions we talked about before, companies stopped sponsoring them overall because of just longevity and the concerns that it was going to cost too much. Shareholders don't like that, right? And remember, shareholders, as far as you're concerned, the head of a company, a publicly traded company, their fiduciary responsibility is to their shareholders.
Right?
It's to maximize shareholder value. How do they do that? By maximizing company profits. How do they do that? Well, yeah, increasing revenue, but also decreasing expense. And one of those expenses are pension contributions. So they went to these 401ks. And 401ks have great benefits, right? You put pre-tax money in the plan so that, if you put away 70 cents, you get $1 in the plan, let's say, depending upon your bracket. Number two, it all grows tax deferred until you retire. And in most cases, the employer puts in matching. So you're getting free money. Lots of great things about 401ks. But the problem is if you're overloaded in that 401k, now when you retire, every single dime that you pull out for income is going to come out as taxable income. So what you've done is you've lopsided your retirement toward things that have a higher exposure should Uncle Sam raise taxes.
And that's a problem, Dave. Of course, like you said, as you're heading into retirement. So what can people do, right? As they're making this transition phase,
Mhm.
they're planning to retire very soon. What should they do with that 401k?
Well, first of all, it helps if you start earlier. Okay, so I know one of our listeners came in at age 45, and I thought that was great because you have to start thinking about how do I diversify my retirement savings. Right? We think about diversifying investments, stocks and bonds and real estate and everything. We also have to think about diversifying your strategies when it comes to taxes, right? So Roth contributions. If you're at an income level where you can afford to make Roth contributions, then you should do that because Roth contributions are the opposite. You put in after-tax dollars, they grow tax deferred, then all the money you take out can be withdrawn taxably. So you have three buckets of money, Sarah, right? You've got your tax deferred bucket, which is your 401ks or maybe 403bs or 457 deferred comp plans if you work for a governmental entity. Then you have your tax-free stuff, which are things like municipal bonds or Roth IRAs, or even, for some people, you do the rich man's Roth, what they call overfunded life insurance, where you're using life insurance as an investment to get tax-free cash flow in retirement. But then you have a third category, and that's your taxable investments. And you need to diversify those. So Typically, the taxable investments are for things that you're going to cash out a lump sum of money, whether it's paying college tuition over 4 years, or although you could do 529 plans and get that tax-free too, right?
There's a lot of different options for those.
That's an option there. But, you know, or if you're going to buy a vacation home, maybe you want to have it in taxable investments, cash them out, pay capital gains rates. But when you get to retirement, you want to make sure you have at least a tax-deferred bucket and a tax-free bucket. Again, you want to diversify your tax strategies in retirement.
Yeah. Well, it's always important to diversify your methods. I think that's great advice. Now I want to get to our Ask Dave question, which is interesting, Dave. This one came from Barbara, and she did not give us a state, but Barbara must have been listening to either last week's show or the show before that, where we were talking about the banking crisis and what's been going on. I think last week we talked about how to invest in banks, when to invest in banks. So Barbara's question is, what about credit unions? Are they at risk like the banks?
Yeah, so Barbara, we talked about you know, how the big banks, the big conglomerates have a little bit more protection because they have different profit centers. They make profits off proprietary trading. You know, they make profits off investment banking, lots of other things. The regional banks are kind of limited, which is why they get squeezed when the net interest margin gets squeezed, when the difference in short-term and long-term rates is really close together. That reduces their margin. But also if there's a request for substantial withdrawals and the loans and bonds they hold have gone down in value because interest rates went up. So when you talk about credit unions, I'd put them in the same position as the regional banks. They're not diversified. They have a lot of the same concerns as a regional bank. So what does that mean for you? Well, first of all, it means you probably want to stay within the limits. And it's not the FDIC. I believe it's the I'm trying to remember, for credit unions, they have the FSLIC. I'm trying to remember the name of it, but another organization that's really copies the FDIC. So if you stay under those dollar limits, you're protected. If you go over those dollar limits, just like you do with regional banks or big banks, then there's no explicit FDIC insurance. So just be smart about it. And also look at the health of your credit union specifically. Look at their financials. Most credit unions do make those public to members in certain intervals, so you want to pay attention to that.
Well, Barbara, thank you so much for emailing us your Ask Dave question. And if anyone out there has a question that you want Dave to answer, send us an email. You can write us a comment. If you email us, the email address is askdave@retirementincomesource, SOURCE.com. And we appreciate you spending your weekend here with us on the Retirement Income Source. I'm Sarah Samuels. I'm here with Dave Scranton. We're covering the 6 most common retirement fears and tips for you to overcome them. One of the biggest things, I think the biggest thing, my biggest advice, right? I'm not the financial advisor here, but investing for income. Look into this method. Look into the strategy. If you don't know anything about it, which hopefully all of our listeners are familiar with it at this point, but look into it and why it's different, because that's why we do this show every week, just trying to explain the strategy to you and how it can help you overcome these fears.
And you can diversify and invest for income. You know, you can invest for income in the stock market. You can invest, you know, high dividend stock strategies. It was part of the secret that, again, allowed us to actually make money in our stock strategies last year in 2022 when the market was down double digits. You can do it in the income world. You can do it with bonds. You can do it with preferreds. You can do it with, you know, other financial tools like that. At today's interest rates, you can actually start to generate some income in banks. Although you can't get good interest rates in banks long term, it's all 2-3 years, so it's short term, which is unfortunate. You could do it through annuities and so on. So you want to invest for income, but in those transition years, the 10 years leading up to retirement, but you want to be diversified. But again, you also want to be diversified when it comes to taxes, right? Think about it this way. If you have $1 million in your 401k and you're in a 30% bracket, you own 700,000 of it and the IRS owns 300,000. If politicians decide to raise taxes by 10%, they immediately have usurped 100,000 of your money. And now their share is 400,000 and your share is 600,000. So simply by a stroke of a pen in Congress, they could take a lump sum of your money. So diversify according to taxes, and yes, start to make that transition from total return focused to income focus, and diversify your investments through the universe, as I like to say, of income generating strategies.
Yeah. Well, just a few minutes ago, Dave, you mentioned how is the time, of course, to make this transition before you could see your account balance drop and before these interest rates go back down. So tell us more about how you made the switch into income investing. Gosh, I guess it was 20 some years ago now, right?
Yeah, yeah. Well, you don't have to say it that way. You know, you always
Many decades ago.
Once in a show, you always just say something that makes me feel old, even though you
I'm
don't mean
sorry,
to.
Dave. I just mean
But
you have a lot
yeah,
of experience.
1999, we're going on a quarter century here, yes. And I was fortunate because back then, the alternatives paid a nice rate of interest, even better than today. But just like today, you know, you look at where the markets are, you look at all the risks out there, whether you're looking geopolitical, risk of recession, or even inflation running even more rampant, and the Federal Reserve causing recession by jamming up interest rates even more, the risks of bank failures, right? All these risks, you know, really all point in the same direction, that if you're in those 10 years leading up to retirement, or you're retired and you haven't made that transition from total return focused to income focused, now is the time to do it. Before the Fed sees recession, they start pushing interest rates back down. Now you might have bigger drops in your portfolio, i.e. less money. And when you move it to income, you'll get even less income because it's a lower interest rate. So it's kind of reminiscent of 1999 in many ways.
Yep. So now is the time to make the switch.
Yeah.
Well, I hope you enjoyed listening to the show. And if you want to listen to it again, or maybe even send it to your friends and families, you can by going to retirementincomesourceradio.com.
That's right. And we thank you for joining us. And we hope you'll join us next week right here. I'm David Scranton here with Sarah Samuels, and this is the Retirement Income Source, where it's all about the income.